He looked at her hands, rough from scrubbing dishes and carrying heavy trays. And then he laughed, not a happy laugh, but the sound of pure, unfiltered arrogance. Because Preston Holloway, a man whose suit cost more than the waitress's car, believed he could humiliate her for sport. Leaning in as he swirled his vintage wine and sneered, telling her, "Tell me, darling, can you even speak Italian? Or is the menu just pretty pictures to you?" Thinking silence meant stupidity and money meant immunity. Never realizing who was really standing at his table, or that by the time the dessert course arrived, he would wish he had never opened his mouth. Because this was the story of how a billionaire learned the hardest lesson of his life. The Friday night dinner rush at Vincenzo's was not merely a busy shift, but a battlefield of porcelain and pretension. A restaurant in the heart of the financial district that didn't just serve food, but served status. With low lighting, aggressively blinding white tablecloths, and air heavy with the smell of black truffles and old money. While Alice Bennett adjusted her apron in the narrow mirrored hallway connecting the kitchen to the dining room. 28 years old, with a kind of beauty often overlooked because it was buried beneath exhaustion. Her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that tugged at her temples, and her stiff, black waistcoat and trousers clinging like a straitjacket. As Giovanni, the floor manager, hissed past her clutching a reservation tablet like a shield. "Table 4 is asking for the sommelier again, and Alice, fix your collar. You look like you've been running a marathon," to which she murmured, "I have been." Gio, fixing it immediately as she checked her reflection and saw dark circles haunting the skin beneath her eyes, poorly concealed by drugstore concealer. While nobody at Vincenzo's cared that her mother Martha had started her third round of chemo that morning, or that Alice had spent from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. transcribing legal documents just to pay the heating bill before sleeping 3 hours and coming here. Because here she was only a vessel for pasta and wine, a pair of hands, a phantom. Pushing through the heavy velvet curtains into the dining room where the noise hit her instantly in a low, sophisticated roar of clinking silverware and deals being struck, forcing her to take a deep breath and center herself. Rent, medical bills, groceries, just get through the night as she worked Section B. Prime real estate near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, usually reserved for VIPs, regulars who tipped well but demanded your soul in exchange. And as she cleared an appetizer plate from a polite elderly couple, she saw the hostess guiding a new party to table 12. The best table in the house, her stomach dropping because she knew him by reputation like every server in the city knew Preston Holloway. The hedge fund manager who appeared in Forbes almost as often as he appeared in tabloids for lawsuits involving unpaid contractors. A man who moved through the world as if he owned the pavement, patrolling rather than walking. Accompanied by a younger woman dripping in diamonds that caught the candlelight. Nervous eyes darting as if afraid to touch anything. While Preston sat without waiting for his chair, snapping his fingers at empty air and barking, "Menu," making Alice's heart hammer as she passed the dirty plates to a busboy, smoothed her apron. Reminded herself she was professional, educated, strong, capable of handling a bully in a bespoke suit. Then approached with practiced grace to place 2 leather-bound menus down and say, "Good evening, sir, madam. Welcome to Vincenzo's. My name is Alice, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with?" Only for Holloway to cut her off without looking up, dismissively waving his hand while frowning at the wine list as if personally insulted. Ordering sparkling water and none of that domestic trash. The Pellegrino with ice on the side because he hated diluted bubbles. To which Alice replied steadily, "Of course, sir," turning to the woman to ask her preference. Only for Preston to answer for her, "She have the same, bring the bread basket. The focaccia better be warm, because last time it was lukewarm and unacceptable for these prices," prompting Alice to promise it would come straight from the oven before turning to leave. Stopped by his sneered, "Wait," forcing her to pause and turn back as he finally looked up. Eyes cold and assessing her not as a human, but as an object that disappointed him. Scanning her scuffed shoes, fraying cuff, and tired shoulders as he accused her of being new to the section and demanded to know where. Antonio was because Antonio usually served him, and Alice, still polite, replied that Antonio was off tonight, sir. I assure you, I am fully capable of providing excellent service. Preston laughed a dry, hacking sound that scraped the air. Capable? We'll see. You look like you'd be more comfortable working at a diner, sweetheart. Try not to spill anything on my suit. It's Italian silk. Worth more than your yearly salary, I'd wager. The woman across from him looked down at her lap, embarrassed, and Alice felt the heat rush into her cheeks. A sharp flush of humiliation she forced herself to swallow. I'll get your water, sir, she said, turning crisply on her heel. And as she walked away, she heard him mutter to his companion, loud enough for her to hear. Hard to find good help. They hire anyone off the street these days. Probably can't even spell or drive. At the service station, Alice gripped the silver water pitcher so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Do it for Mom, she told herself. Do it for the medicine. But the night was just beginning, and Preston Holloway was only getting warmed up. By 8:30 p.m., the restaurant was at capacity. The kitchen buried in chaos, tickets printing endlessly while chefs shouted in a frantic mix of English and Neapolitan dialect. Steam from the pasta water thickening the air until it felt heavy to breathe. Alice was juggling 3 tables at once, yet Preston Holloway demanded 90% of her attention, sending back the wine. Claiming it was corked, though it wasn't, sending back the bread for being too doughy. Snapping his fingers at her from across the room while she was taking another table's order. When she finally approached table 12 for their main course, Preston was leaning forward, speaking in a low, intense voice to the woman he called Jessica. The merger has to happen in Milan, he said, desperation sharp beneath the bravado. If the regulatory board looks too closely at the books in New York, we're finished. That's why I need you to sign the papers as the temporary trustee. Jessica looked terrified. But Preston, I don't understand Italian law. What if quiet, Preston hissed, spotting Alice, instantly sitting back and smoothing his tie as his demeanor flipped from conspirator to king. Are you ready to order? Alice asked, pad in hand. Preston stared at her with renewed disdain, lifting the menu written entirely in Italian with small English descriptions beneath. Vincenzo's prided itself on authenticity. I'll have the ossobuco, he said, mangling it as ossobu, and she will have the risotto ai funghi. Excellent choices, Alice replied evenly. Would you like to hear the specials? We have a wonderful, Preston cut her off with a sharp gesture. I don't need the specials. I need competence. A cruel glint flashed in his eyes as he glanced at Jessica, eager to assert dominance. Tell me, he said, leaning back and crossing his arms, do you even know what you're serving, or do you just memorize the numbers? I know the menu very well, sir, Alice said softly. Really? Preston smirked. Because this is an Italian establishment, a place of culture. Do you speak the language, or are you just pretending? Though the restaurant roared around them, it felt as if the noise at table 12 collapsed into a vacuum. A nearby couple paused mid-bite to watch as Alice tightened her grip on her pen. I understand the menu perfectly, sir. That's not what I asked, Preston goaded. I asked if you speak Italian. Parler Italiano. He butchered the accent, turning it into a mockery. Alice hesitated. She could answer him, shut him down, but she knew the rules. Never outshine the guest, never make them feel stupid, even when they are wrong. Embarrassing a high roller like Holloway could cost her the job, and she couldn't risk the paycheck. I know enough to ensure your dining experience is perfect, she deflected. Preston barked out a laugh that drew stares from across the room. I knew it, ignorant. Just another uneducated girl carrying plates. It's pathetic, really. You work in an Italian restaurant and you can't even speak the language of the food you serve. Turning to Jessica as if Alice no longer existed, he said, "See, this is the problem with this country. No standards. In Rome, the waiters are professionals. Here we get high school dropouts." Jessica looked mortified. "Preston, please stop. It's fine." "It's not fine, Jessica. It's about excellence." He looked back at Alice, eyes narrowing. "Since you're so limited, I'll make it simple. Bring us the food. Don't speak unless spoken to, and try to look a little less miserable. You're ruining the ambiance." Something cold and solid settled in Alice's stomach, not fear, but a calm, icy rage. She nodded once, sharp and mechanical. "As you wish, sir." She walked away with her spine straight as steel, and when she reached the service station, Giovanni grabbed her arm, having seen everything. "Alice, take 5 minutes," he whispered. "You're shaking." "I'm fine," she replied, her voice eerily calm. "He's a pig," Giovanni muttered, "but he spends $5,000 a month here. Just endure it. He'll be gone in an hour." "Oh, I'll endure it," Alice whispered, her gaze sliding back to table 12 where Preston had leaned in again, murmuring to Jessica as he deliberately switched languages and began speaking in fluent, rapid-fire Italian, clearly assuming that because Alice had dodged his question and because she was, in his mind, nothing more than a high school dropout waitress. The air around him was safe and the language barrier an unbreakable wall. Alice stood by the espresso machine polishing a glass, closed her eyes for a brief second, and tuned out the kitchen's clatter to sharpen her hearing, remembering how her mother, Martha, hadn't always been sick before the cancer, before the debt. She had been a professor of Romance languages at Columbia University, and how Alice hadn't merely learned Italian in a classroom, but had grown up spending summers in Florence, earning a master's degree in comparative linguistics. She wasn't using because the academic job market had collapsed, and she needed fast cash for medical bills, making her not just fluent, but native level. So from 20 feet away across the din of the dining room, she clearly heard Preston say in Italian, "Listen, Jessica, it doesn't matter if the documents are fake. Once you sign, the debt is in your name. I'll be clean if the bank investigates. You take the fall, and I keep the money. You're the only one who can save me." And Alice's eyes snapped open as the polishing cloth froze in her hands, because this was no longer arrogance, but a crime. A setup to destroy a terrified woman's life over a plate of risotto while he assumed them Waitress was furniture. She looked back at the table where Preston smiled and poured more wine. Convinced he had already won, set the glass down and said, "Giovanni," her voice transformed as exhaustion vanished into sharp, dangerous clarity, "I'm going to take the dessert order for table 12. Prompting Giovanni to warn, "Alice, don't let Marco take it. You don't need the abuse." But Alice untied her apron and retied it tighter like a soldier gearing up for battle, a small cold smile touching her lips as she insisted that Mr. Holloway and she had a lot to talk about. Lifting the dessert menu and no longer looking like a victim, but like a predator spotting a wounded gazelle as she walked back through the dining room, not like a servant, but like she owned the place. Her movement shifting from frantic server to silent hunter while the clink of silverware, the jazz hum and laughter faded until only table 12 and the crime in plain sight existed. She stopped at the service station to lift the main course tray. Heavy ceramic plates of ossobuco and risotto ai funghi piping hot as the expediter warned her to be careful. Yet she felt no heat, only cold resolve, thinking of Jessica's trembling hands and naive trust. Of her own mother in a hospital bed, worried about bills while insurance companies played games. Of men like Preston Holloway treating the world like monopoly boards they flipped when losing. Not tonight. As she approached the table where Preston had switched back to English, leaning back smugly, swirling red wine beside a thick folder of documents, opened dangerously close to the butter plate while he crooned false reassurance about temporary holding shells and trustees and a flight to LA by Tuesday. Jessica clutching a gold fountain pen and hesitating about lawyers and legal jargon until Preston's smile tightened and he pressed trust over caution. At which point Alice stepped into the pool of their table's light and said, "Pardon the interruption." "Your entree," prompting Preston to glare and cover the papers with his hand as she gently placed the risotto before Jessica. Risotto with wild porcini mushrooms finished with truffle oil, then set the ossobuco before Preston as the rich scent of braised veal and saffron rose between them. Earning a grunt of satisfaction and a dismissive order for more wine, yet Alice did not move, standing perfectly at the table's edge with her hands clasped behind her back until Preston snapped, sensing her presence, "Is there a problem?" and finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "I said you can go," Preston snapped. But Alice met his gaze and for the first time all night did not look down, instead staring directly into his eyes as a small, unreadable smile touched her lips while she began. "Mi scusi, signor," her voice transforming as the flat, tired American accent vanished and was replaced by the crisp, melodic diction of someone trained in the lecture halls of Florence. "Excuse me, sir, I just wanted to ensure the flavor was to your liking. Sometimes the meat can be tough if it is not cooked with honesty." And Preston froze with his fork suspended halfway to his mouth as the color drained from his face, as if a shade had been yanked down. Jessica blinking between them in confusion and asking what Alice had said, just as Preston dropped his fork with a loud clatter against the china and stammered, eyes wide and locked on Alice, that she was babbling, but Alice stepped closer, invading his space by a fraction and whispering with perfect enunciation and flawless Italian that he had said ignorance was the only requirement for the job and that he was mistaken because ignorance was dangerous, especially when one discussed bank fraud out loud in a public place, leaving Preston gaping like a fish pulled onto a dock as Jessica's voice rose in panic, demanding to know what was happening and accusing Preston of saying she didn't speak Italian. At which point Alice turned to Jessica and switched back to English, her tone warm and compassionate, telling her clearly that he had lied just as he was lying about the papers, prompting Preston to slam his hand on the table and shout that Alice was fired as he shoved his chair back and drew the attention of the entire restaurant while Giovanni rushed over pale-faced. Yet Alice remained calm and declared in the sudden silence that she might be fired, but Preston Holloway was going to jail. The atmosphere at Vincenzo's instantly shifting as Giovanni tried to intervene and Preston sputtered accusations of harassment and lawsuits while Alice refused to move, insisting that if she left Jessica would sign documents making her liable for millions in fraudulent debt, causing Jessica to gasp and recoil as Preston screamed that Alice was lying and trying to extort him, only for Alice to calmly quote his Italian words verbatim about fake documents and taking the fall, leaving Jessica staring at Preston's sweat-slicked face and darting eyes as she whispered for the truth, yanking her hand away when he pleaded and grabbing the folder just as Preston lunged, only to be blocked by Alice's body as she commanded him not to touch her, Preston raising a clenched fist until a deep voice from the next table ordered him to do it, freezing him as an older silver-haired man in an understated suit stood, Judge Arthur Sterling, whom Alice recognized instantly, the Federal Circuit judge known to terrify Wall Street criminals, who approached with granite authority and advised Preston to lower his hand unless he wanted to add assault to the felonies he had already confessed to. Preston going gray as recognition hit while Sterling dryly cut him off and stated that he spoke enough Italian to have heard every word about fake documents and clean hands. She takes the fall. It was quite the confession, Judge Sterling said as Preston slumped back into his chair, utterly defeated, the fight draining out of him until only a hollow shell remained, while Jessica stood up clutching her purse, shaking as tears streamed down her face. Looking from the papers to Preston before ripping the contract in half, then into quarters, and flinging the paper confetti into his face as she sobbed that she had been willing to mortgage her grandmother's house for him and had trusted him. Preston weakly calling after her to wait only for her to spit, "Don't," before turning to Alice with no words, simply squeezing her hand in gratitude and whispering thank you over and over until Alice gently urged her to go. Get a cab, go home, and Jessica fled the restaurant, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood as the only sound in the room, while Preston sat amid the shredded papers with the asu buka growing cold in front of him and demanded his check, prompting Judge Sterling to scoff that he wasn't going anywhere because his detail had already been texted and the police were on their way, which they were 10 minutes later in a quiet, discreet affair befitting Vincenzo's reputation, 2 officers escorting a silent, sullen Preston Holloway out the back to avoid the paparazzi, already gathering outside as squad car lights flashed through the windows and the dining room slowly returned to life with a different energy. Patrons no longer focused on phones or food but staring at Alice, who was in the back hallway leaning against the wall as the adrenaline drained from her body and her hands finally began to shake. Giovanni appearing with a glass of water and exhaustion etched into his face as Alice asked if she was fired, staring into the rippling surface while Giovanni sighed beside her and noted that Preston Holloway spent $60,000 a year there. Alice apologizing that she couldn't let him do it. Giovanni agreeing Preston was a pig and truly seeing her for the first time in months as he remarked on her Italian being better than his despite being from Naples. Alice explaining her mother had been a professor and she'd grown up bilingual. Giovanni gently asking why she was carrying trays for minimum wage, and Alice answering simply that her mother's cancer had returned and the treatments were expensive and she needed the tips. Giovanni acknowledging the scene she caused, before smiling through the stress, and telling her Judge Sterling had ordered a 1990 Barolo and refused to drink it unless she poured it because he wanted to talk to her. Giovanni assuring her she wasn't fired and offering her a floor manager position starting tomorrow at double the pay. Tears pricking Alice's eyes as she thanked him and was nudged toward table 14 where Judge Arthur Sterling waited calmly with the expensive bottle unopened, inviting her to sit not as a command but an invitation, joking that he owned the clock for the next hour and offering a proposition as Alice sat gingerly and listened to him praise her sharp mind and ear, how she understood leverage, waited for the perfect moment, gathered evidence, and protected the victim. Alice insisting she'd only done what was right, while Sterling mused on how rare that was and questioned her legal confidence, leading Alice to admit her master's in comparative linguistics, her abandoned LSAT plans, and years spent transcribing legal briefs at 3 in the morning. Sterling studying her before summarizing that she was fluent in Italian, understood contract law, possessed a moral compass strong enough to withstand a billionaire's pressure, and could handle a hostile witness, customer, without breaking a sweat. Then producing a simple cream-colored business card for Sterling Thorne and Associates and explaining his upcoming retirement from the bench and return to international corporate law practice with clients in Milan and Rome, who needed associates capable of reading between the lines as he slid the card across the table. "I can't hire you as a lawyer yet," Sterling said, "but I can hire you as a senior paralegal and translator. The starting salary is significantly higher than what you make here. And we have a very robust health insurance plan that covers immediate family members. 100% coverage." And Alice stared at the card as if the world had stopped spinning. The noise of the restaurant falling away again, but this time replaced not by rage but by hope as she whispered, "Health insurance," and Sterling smiled, adding, "Full dental too. If you can start Monday." causing Alice to look up with tears finally spilling over, not tears of humiliation, but relief as the weight of the tray. The bills, the world itself seemed to lift while she said, her voice trembling, "I can start Monday." And Sterling tapped the wine bottle and asked her to pour it and recount everything Preston had said so the district attorney would have a watertight case. Alice lifting the bottle with steady hands and replying, "With pleasure, Your Honor." As 6 months passed and her life transformed, now a paralegal at Sterling Thorne and Associates in tailored suits instead of a stained waistcoat. Her mother responding well to a treatment protocol finally covered by insurance, yet Preston Holloway's shadow lingered as United States versus Preston Holloway became a media circus with Waitress, whistleblower headlines and a PR machine, painting him as misunderstood, genius and Alice as a debt-ridden opportunist. The trial held at the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where the mahogany and marble cavern smelled of floor wax and anxiety as Alice waited, wringing her hands beside Arthur Sterling, now her boss but unable to represent her, gently reminding her to breathe because she was not on trial. Though it felt that way, especially after learning Preston had hired Clinton Vale, a shark who cared only about creating doubt. And when the bailiff called her to the stand, Alice walked into a packed courtroom, feeling hundreds of eyes on her back. Preston thinner and paler in a modest gray suit, avoiding her gaze, while Clinton Vale silver-haired, perfectly tanned for February, smiling without warmth, watched with predatory stillness as the prosecution's direct examination went smoothly through the insults, rudeness, Italian switch, and fraud phrases before Vale rose, buttoned his jacket, invaded her space, and began smoothly questioning her finances on November 14th, over objection. The judge allowing it as motive, Vale smiling as he listed her rent arrears, maxed credit cards, $40,000 in medical debt, feigning sympathy before hardening his tone to suggest desperation, humiliation and opportunity to invent a crime to extort a settlement. Alice insisting she heard a confession as Vale challenged her Italian, mocking her Queen's background and academic training, scoffing at the Neapolitan dialect and crowded restaurant, pressing that it was easy to mishear things when tired and emotional, and asking, "Isn't it possible?" Before saying, he said, "These documents are complex," rather than, "These documents are fake," Alice said. Because in Italian falsi and faticosi can sound similar over the clatter of dishes to an untrained ear. And she saw the doubt creeping into the juror's eyes as Vale worked expertly to shrink her expertise into something that looked like a high school hobby. But Alice insisted she hadn't misheard him, that he had said falsi very clearly, only for Vale to lean in until his face was inches from hers and ask if she was sure. Because if she was wrong, she had destroyed a man's life over a misunderstanding, demanding she swear on her mother's life that she hadn't heard what she wanted to hear, just to get revenge on a rude customer. The courtroom falling silent as Alice looked at Preston and saw the tiny triumphant smirk on his face, took a deep breath, thought of the fear in Jessica's eyes that night and the arrogance that followed it, and said calmly that she was not wrong, prompting Vale to dismiss her with a wave like she was garbage as she stepped down with legs like jelly, feeling she had failed while the seed of the angry broke waitress narrative took root. By the third day of trial, the federal courtroom felt suffocating, the air conditioning humming uselessly as the exhausted jury sat through forensic accounting, boredom, and character assassinations. Clinton Vale reclining in his leather chair like a man who had already ordered victory champagne after successfully painting Alice Bennett as a disgruntled, financially desperate employee who hallucinated a crime to pay her mother's medical bills. Preston leaning over to whisper if it was over and if he could leave. Vale reassuring him that the prosecution was running on fumes and had nothing left but hearsay, until Assistant U.S. Attorney David Ross stood up adjusting his tie, not defeated but confident, and called Professor Dante Rossi to the stand. sending a ripple of confusion through the gallery and even drawing a look over the spectacles of Judge Margaret. Calloway, as an elderly man, entered with old-world dignity, in a worn tweed jacket and thick tortoise-shell glasses, tapping a cane against the wood while sharp, terrifyingly intelligent eyes scanned the room. Alice sitting straighter as she recognized the former terror of the Columbia Linguistics Department. Vale barely glancing up dismissively as Ross established 40 years of teaching, 12 books on Romance languages, and UN consultancy before Rossi stepped forward and affirmed he had reviewed Alice's testimony and dedicated his life to the study of language, which he described as the DNA of intent, leading Ross to address the defense's claim that falsi and faticosi sound identical in a noisy restaurant. Vale objecting that it was speculation, Ross countering with phonetics, and Judge Calloway overruling as Rossi adjusted his glasses and explained patiently to the jury that while a tourist might confuse them, Alice Bennett, his student for 4 years, possessed absolute pitch, though that wasn't even the point, because the defense relied on a false assumption that the two words share stress patterns. Falsi carrying trochaic stress on the first syllable, while faticosi has 4 syllables and a secondary stress. The rhythm entirely different. Impossible to confuse, like mistaking a drum beat for a violin solo, no matter how loud the restaurant, prompting Vale to rise and mock the theory as ivory tower textbook Italian, unsuited to the messy slang of Milan trading floors, only for Rossi to respond calmly that language follows rules, even criminal ones, and when Vale suggested non-native slips of the tongue, Rossi smiled coldly and said he had hoped for that argument as he reached for a document on the stand. Ms. Bennett testified that Mr. Holloway said once you sign, the debt is in your name, and then if the bank investigates, you take the blame. So Vale scoffed, insisting he was merely warning her about the risks of the investment and that it proved he was looking out for her. But on the contrary, Rossi said, his voice dropping an octave and commanding absolute silence, it proved he was manipulating her, because the verb indagare, to investigate, when used in a hypothetical clause involving risk, triggers the subjunctive mood in formal Italian, and a native speaker would say, sabanca Inez, yet Mr. Holloway used the indicative, the grammar of an English speaker translating directly in his head. And here was the key as Rossi pointed a long bony finger at Preston Holloway. So Bennett quoted him using the word Preston, Vale rolling his eyes and saying they'd been over this, that it sounded like presto, meaning what? He wanted the deal done. Paul, no Mr. Vale, Rossi snapped. His patience gone. Prestonome does not mean what? It is a compound noun, prester to lend, nome name, a name lender. And in Italian Legal Code Article 374, a preome is a straw man, a front used specifically to shield the beneficial owner from criminal liability during money laundering. The jury beginning to shift as notes were taken furiously while Rossi continued relentlessly that the word presum has a very specific dental fricative sound structure, that it does not sound like presto, it does not sound like pressed, and that it is a word you only learn if you are studying 2 things, advanced criminal law or how to commit a crime. Rossi leaning forward to say you don't accidentally order a straw man for dinner along with your risotto, Mr. Vale. And a waitress from Queens doesn't hallucinate a specific forensic accounting term in a Neapolitan dialect unless she heard it loud and clear. Vale looking stunned as the slip of the tongue defense backfired spectacularly, his attempt to paint Preston as a casual speaker collapsing as Rossi proved the specific vocabulary Preston used revealed a premeditated intent to defraud. Vale stammering that he could have heard it in a movie. Perhaps, Rossi replied dryly, The Godfather maybe, though he believed they preferred the term consigliere. Laughter erupting in the gallery until the judge banged her gavel and asked if Mr. Vale was done. Vale sitting down red-faced as Preston glared at him, whispering furiously to fix this. But the nightmare not ending there, because as Rossi stepped down, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom were shoved open, and a female voice cried, "Let me through," as a bailiff shouted for her to stop. The commotion halting proceedings as a woman in a trench coat and large sunglasses pushed past security, her blonde hair messy as if she'd been running, ripping off the sunglasses to reveal red-rimmed, terrified eyes and a jaw set in stone, as it was Jessica. "Your Honor," she screamed, clutching her purse to her chest. "Stop the trial, I have it." Preston Holloway leaping up so fast his chair crashed backward as he gasped, "Jessica," his face draining of blood. "No, no, don't." "Sit down, Mr. Holloway," Judge Calloway ordered, signaling the marshals as she asked who this woman was. David Ross, equally shocked, identifying her as Jessica Moore, the missing witness. Jessica running down the center aisle, ignoring the bailiff and reaching for her arm. Not looking at Alice or the judge, but straight at Preston, with eyes burning with love and hate as she sobbed that he told her she was crazy, that Alice was lying, that she had to hide in London until it blew over. But she listened to it. She finally listened to it. Vale roaring objection and calling it highly irregular because she wasn't on the list and couldn't burst in and testify. Jessica yelling she didn't want to testify as she ripped a small black digital recorder from her bag and slammed it onto the prosecutor's table, saying she wanted to play this. The room freezing as she told the jury he made her record their business meetings for corporate compliance. Said he wanted to protect them, and that she turned it on in the restaurant that night and forgot it was running in her purse. Vale staring at the recorder like it was a bomb and protesting chain of custody until Judge Calloway, icy voice, told him to sit down and asked Jessica if she swore it was unedited. Jessica whispering she swore it on her life. The judge turning to the prosecutor and ordering play it as Preston shouted, "No, you can't." Two marshals forcing him back into his chair as he shook with sweat pouring down his forehead. David Ross connecting the device to the courtroom audio system and pressing play. Static filling the room, followed by the ambient noise of Vincenzo's, the clink of silverware, the hum of jazz. And then Preston's voice, not the polished voice he used in court, but the sneering, arrogant voice of a man who thought he was a god, saying the merger has to happen in Milan because if the regulatory board looks too closely at the books in New York, we're finished. And the jury leaned in as the sound of Alice approaching followed on the tape, the polite introduction, the dismissal. And then the smoking gun as Jessica Preston's voice boomed through the speakers. Professor Rossi in the front row nodding solemnly, falsy, clear as a bell. The translation no longer needed because the tone said it all. The tone of a predator explaining the trap to the bait. Then the rustle of fabric on the recording, and Alice's voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Susie Sinor, as the courtroom listened to the entire exchange. Alice's perfect Italian, Preston's panicked denial. The shattering of the glass. And finally the last words on the tape spoken by Preston in English after Alice walked away the first time. "Dumb waitress. She's too stupid to know she's holding the match that burns her own life down." Ross clicking the stop button, and the silence that followed being absolute, the silence of a grave. Alice looking across the aisle at Preston as he stared at the table with his hands trembling violently. Not looking at the jury or his lawyer, knowing the shark in the pinstripe suit knew the game was over. Alice feeling no triumph or joy, but a profound quiet release as the weight of the tray was gone forever. Judge Calloway looking at the jury box as the jurors stared at Preston Holloway with pure, unadulterated disgust. Mr. Ross quietly asked if the prosecution rested. Ross looking at the recorder, then at Alice, and smiling as he said, "Yes, Your Honor, the people rest." And 3 years later, Alice sitting in a corner booth at Vincenzo's for the first time back as a customer wearing a cream-colored suit that cost more than her old car. Across from her Giovanni, no longer the manager, but the owner who had bought the place when the previous owners retired. To the new junior partner Giovanni beaming as he raised a glass of vintage vino. Alice clinking her glass to the best risotto in New York and savoring the taste of victory as her mother lived in remission in a Florida condo Alice had bought for her. Alice having finished law school at night while working for Sterling and passing the bar exam in the top 1% of the state. Preston Holloway serving year 3 of a 15-year sentence in a federal correctional facility in Otisville. Jessica testifying against him for immunity and now running a nonprofit helping victims of financial abuse. Alice looking out at the New York skyline and noticing a new waiter nervously serving a nearby table where a rude businessman snapped his fingers complaining about the water. Alice watching the waiter freeze in terror as she stood up. No longer just a patron, but Alice Bennett Esquire who didn't tolerate bullies. Walking over and placing a gentle hand on the waiter's shoulder before looking down at the businessman and asking, with that same dangerous polite steel, if there was a problem. The man recognizing her and stammering that everything was excellent. Alice smiling and saying the service in this city is world-class if you know how to listen. Walking back to her table, leaving the man silent and the waiter smiling. And that being the story of how arrogance became Preston Holloway's downfall because he thought money gave him the right to treat people like furniture and forgot the golden rule. Be careful who you step on because they might be the only one who knows how to save you or destroy you. Alice proving that dignity and education are worth more than any Italian silk suit. And if you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. And tell me in the comments below if you've ever seen instant karma happen in real life. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.